I really seem to have a thing for tragic prequel games. Xenoblade 2 Torna The Golden Country was one of my most anticipated games back when it was announced in 2018. And despite its short length, it's absolutely my favorite game I played in that year. Right after Smash Ultimate. So, 2 years later, Nintendo suddenly dropped this bomb on us. I was hyped. I always thought Breath of the Wild was a pretty good game, but one of my biggest complaints I had was how little we got to see of the champions. So, when Nintendo announced they would release a Warriors game, which I love by the way, that takes place during the Great Calamity, I was pretty excited to say the least. Even before the game came out, I noticed a lot of parallels between the stories of Age of Calamity and Torna. Today I want to share some of those similarities and differences I found, and also look at which game is the better prequel when it comes to storytelling and building on the original narratives. Let's start this off with the similarities in how both games are set up. In Breath of the Wild, people often refer back to the Great Calamity that took place 100 years ago. It's during these events that Ganon took control of all the Guardians and managed to kill all the champions aside from Link, who got fatally wounded. The most we get to see of this in the main story is through Link's memories that we get to recover throughout the game. And it's of course during this time period that Age of Calamity takes place. Very similarly, in Xenoblade 2 there was the Aegis War. This refers back to the struggle between Mithra and Malos and took place around 500 years before Xenoblade 2's main story. Much like the Great Calamity, the Aegis War didn't really have a happy outcome either. While Malos was defeated, 3 titans got destroyed in the process, and along them, the many people that were living on them died as well. This all sets the stage for Xenoblade 2's prequel, Torna The Golden Country, finally showing us everything that happened 500 years ago. The fact that both prequels are set during those specific periods opens up some new possibilities. Both stories hyped up some important characters without giving them the attention they truly deserved. In Breath of the Wild we saw the champions in multiple cutscenes, but at the end of the game I still felt like I wanted to see more of them. In Age of Calamity they all have much more relevance in the main story and we even get to play as all of them. In Torna The Golden Country we get to know Laura and Adam, who appeared in a lot of flashbacks in Xenoblade 2. We get to play as them and see just how they made their mark to still be remembered 500 years later. In both games we also get a look at some more obscure characters. Impa and Minov are both very minor characters in their original games that we get to play as in their prime thanks to the prequels. But there are some pretty big differences here as well. And this is where I need to go into really heavy spoiler territory for both games. If you haven't beaten them yet and want to experience these stories for yourself first, you might wanna head out. With that said, let's talk about the biggest difference. One of these stories is canon, the other is not. For better or worse, Age of Calamity implemented some time travel shenanigans and made it so that the champions survive. I often made the joke to my friends that the game turns into one big fanfic from chapter 5 onwards. But hey, at least it's a pretty decent fanfic. I personally don't think the story was anything too special, but considering the 2 Nintendo Warriors games that came before, it could have been much worse. And I gotta admit, seeing my boy Silent come in to save his sister was definitely the highlight of the game for me. But let's stay on track. This video was supposed to be about story parallels with Xenoblade 2 after all. Well then, let's look at Zelda and Mithra. They both have a unique kind of power that they need to master in some way. The difference is that Mithra needs to learn how to keep it under control, while Zelda needs to learn how to awaken it within her. Both of these powers also affect the stories in very important ways. Mithra trying to control the artifice is something that gets brought up a lot throughout the story, and her losing that control is ultimately what triggers the bad ending and the destruction of the Torna Titan. Zelda, on the other hand, has spent almost her entire life trying to awaken the power to seal away the darkness. And her learning to use it while saving Link was the only reason why hope wasn't completely lost in Breath of the Wild's original story. And despite everything that got changed in Age of Calamity, she still learns how to use it because she wanted to save Link. It's also worth noting how both Zelda and Mithra unlocked their powers after they saw the people closest to them in danger. There is one last big difference I want to bring up: how both games end. If you go back to the trailers of Age of Calamity and take a look at the comment sections, you can see just how many people were expecting a bad ending. And I mean, can you really blame them? It's kind of what all the trailers were leading up to. I think a lot of people thought we would get something alike to Torna's ending, where we'd get to see the heroes fail and the stage being set for the main game. But speaking of Torna's ending, it's not so happy. Almost half of the main characters die, and what basically amounts to an entire continent gets destroyed. It's depressing as all hell, and it's also one of my favorite endings to any piece of media. Everything was just so perfectly executed. The music and voice acting along those heartbreaking moments made it truly unforgettable. I'd like to go into more detail some other time, but for now I'll say that alongside the final face-off against Malos, the ending was my personal highlight of the DLC. For comparison, Age of Calamity's emotional climax is a fucking robot blowing up. I'm still a bit conflicted on how I feel about this story as a whole, if it wasn't obvious enough. And while some of what I'll say might come off as a bit harsh, I ask that you hear me out first. I feel everything was pretty decent for most of the first half. But while Chapter 5 definitely had the best moment in the game for me, it's also the point where the story started to take a big nosedive. The big new villain Astor got some pretty great build up throughout the story, but then he just got gobbled up by Ganon at the last minute. Okay. I also didn't like how they faked out Rome's death. I thought his sacrifice was one of the only emotional moments in the game, so when he turned out to be okay, I thought it was pretty lame. Come to think of it, aside from some villains, Terraco is pretty much the only important character who dies, and even he can be revived later on. I've heard people say they wouldn't have liked it if their favorite characters died just like in Breath of the Wild, saying that they wouldn't be able to use them anymore or that they wouldn't be able to get attached to them. I still heavily disagree with this. Torna killed off all the characters after the final battle, meaning you could still play as them for the rest of the game and the post-game, and if you tell me you weren't attached to the party by the end, there's definitely something wrong with you. But over time, I did change my opinion on something else. When I just finished the game, I thought the story was a bit underwhelming, and that was probably because I was expecting it to be like another game, which isn't exactly fair. I wasn't disappointed by the story because it was bad, but because I wanted it to be all depressing like Torna. After realizing that and looking back at the game, it really wasn't as bad as I made it out to be. I still think some of my critiques hold up, but others were definitely just me wanting the game to be something it isn't. I also started to appreciate the smaller touches this game made to make the story more impactful. The change of map music and Zelda taking over as the narrator after Chapter 5 for example. Worst of all, by comparing it so much to Torna, I think I missed just what makes the Warriors game so great. Just how many playable characters there are. I can't think of any important character from Breath of the Wild that isn't playable here. While I haven't given most of the champion's descendants a good try yet, I can say that Sidon is one of my favorite characters to use in any Warriors game. And then there's Master Koga. I've heard some people say that him joining you doesn't make any sense, dishonoring both his character and the legacy of the Yiga clan. And I'll admit, the cutscene where he joins you definitely seems a bit rushed, like the whole thing was a last minute idea. But it still made perfect sense to me. He realized that Astor and Ganon were the biggest threats, and decided that working together with Zelda would be the best for both himself and the clan. And he's also one of the most fun characters to play as, so I don't really care. And I will say that the final chapters were really hype. Storming the castle with your army consisting of all races and people of Hyrule to defeat Ganon once and for all was definitely a great way to end the game. It's clear that Age of Calamity was meant as a big love letter to the people that adored Breath of the Wild. So, what's my final verdict on both games? All in all, I'd say Torna is the better prequel when it comes to storytelling. It tells a beautifully tragic narrative, tying up most loose ends that were left with Xenoblade 2, as well as giving more weight to certain scenes from that game. Age of Calamity, however, is the better prequel when it comes to fan service. Because it isn't canon, it is able to give Zelda fans a chance to play as all their favorite characters, no matter who they might be. A champion, a descendant from them, one of the villains, or even a fucking tree! While these two games might have looked similar at first, they ended up being completely different. Despite their differences, both of these games are great prequels for their own reasons, and I recommend them to anyone that loved the games that came before them. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. If you want to see more like this, all you have to do is click the subscribe button and hit the bell so you'll be notified when I upload next. I can already tell you that more Xenoblade videos are on their way, as well as some from Fire Emblem if you're into that. With that said, I wish you guys the best. This has been Max, signing out.